Welcome to the debate. Our source material today details a period of, well, profound agricultural crisis. We're talking about submerged crops, the threat of famine, and just intense hardship across the board.
And what makes it so compelling is that this natural disaster is then compounded by this layer of explicit organizational corruption. The theft and diversion of promised relief efforts.
Exactly. And that brings us to our central question, our interpretive priority. Is this material fundamentally a moral critique? Is it centered on the immediate, active corruption surrounding that aid?
Or is it more of a broad social commentary, one that's centered on the chronic, almost inevitable agricultural and economic hardship that's just exacerbated by the environmental disaster?
Right. I'm going to argue that the most potent message here is that specific moral failure, the outrage of human greed actively seizing every promised aid.
And I'll be coming at it from a different angle. I believe the text's foundation is the inevitable suffering caused by chronic poverty and environmental factors, with the corruption being more of a tragic symptom than the root cause.
I see where you're coming from with the structural argument. I really do. But I think the text itself almost dictates the interpretive framework by its dramatic shift in focus. The author transitions so rapidly from describing the natural disaster, the millet sinking half lost, to a very decisive moral condemnation. The physical loss is the setup. The greater tragedy is the immediate failure of human systems. The emotional crescendo is reached with that specific indictment that every promised aid is swallowed by private hands. I mean, this isn't some passive lament about fate or the weather. It's an active accusation of theft. The outrage directed at the greedy rat, it's so focused because these individuals intercept the only lifeline available to people who are already, we're told, worn to the bone. The fact that their suffering could have been mitigated just elevates the crime to a profound betrayal. And then on top of that, you have the proverb about ill-gotten wealth. It just reinforces that the ultimate takeaway here is one of moral judgment.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame the order of events a bit differently. To me, the text establishes an overriding sense of environmental and economic precarity that exists as the default state of the farmer. This is happening long before any relief agency or corruption even enters the frame. The very struggle described is existential. We read early on that, in town, a measure of rice is dear and rare. Now, that scarcity isn't caused by the flood or the theft. It's the chronic pre-existing condition. The back-breaking labor, the plow at dawn and weed till dusk, that's just their reality. And to really get the farmer's perspective, look at the fatalism in that proverb. Winter steals in before I'm ready. Next year, we chew tree leaves. That doesn't speak to a momentary crisis caused by stolen aid. It speaks to a cyclic, inevitable famine. So the environmental factors, the chronic lack of reserves, that's the real structural problem. The corruption, it just confirms the unreliability of external systems, but the core issue, impending starvation, was already built in.
Okay, but let's focus specifically on that emotional charge directed at the officials. The author addresses the corrupt figure directly, asking, "Oh, greedy rat, swollen rat, what pity lies in you?" I mean, that specific, emotional, almost personal address demonstrates that the author's deepest frustration is aimed at the moral character of these individuals. They're not just a metaphor for a systemic flaw. They are active human agents who turned a manageable crisis into a definitive catastrophe. We have to consider the function of this kind of critique. Often, an author who's powerless against, vast structural problems will train their full critical fire on the immediate, identifiable act of human malice. It's the only actionable form of justice available through poetry. The specificity of that moral attack really argues for its centrality.
I see why you emphasize the emotional weight, but I'm not convinced that emotional weight translates to being the ultimate focus. I think the rat metaphor serves primarily to highlight the structural powerlessness of the common farmer in this whole ecosystem. The rat thrives because the system is weak and the resources are vulnerable. The material vulnerability, the fact that they are already worn to the bone and that rice is so dear, has already crippled the population. When resources for survival become this scarce, they are inherently vulnerable to capture. So the rat is a symptom of an unbalanced power structure that always allows the powerful to divert resources in times of scarcity. It isn't the source of the perennial suffering itself. If the farmers had existing reserves, this stolen aid would be a tragedy, sure, but it wouldn't be immediately fatal. And that proves that the foundation of the suffering is poverty, not just corruption.
And we really have to talk about the sheer volume of evidence dedicated to agricultural despair versus economic theft. I maintain that the overwhelming focus here is environmental and agricultural. We get these vivid physical descriptions of the crop loss, the millet lows floating, sinking in the channel, the precarious state of new shoots barely visible above water, threatening to scatter like chaff. This extensive detailing of the natural loss, it grounds the entire piece in an environmental tragedy of immense scale. It sets the primary scene for a famine caused by nature, not solely by human hands.
Sure, the descriptive detail is there, but I think the literary function of that description is key here. While the descriptive elements establish the severity of the need, the critical energy of the entire piece is overwhelmingly expended on the moral response to that need. The suffering inherent in the labor and the flood becomes an outrage that demands condemnation only because the promised resolution, the relief, was actively diverted by specific human malice. The structural economic hardship, while, yes, undeniably present, is used by the author as the context needed to magnify the specific, intentional failure that happened at the moment of potential rescue. If the aid had made it through, the disaster would be recorded as unfortunate. Because the aid was stolen, it's recorded as wicked. It's the betrayal of that hope that elevates the critique. And we really need to analyze the specific human action that pushed the community from crisis into catastrophe.
Let's not call it the proximate cause. Let's just call it the immediate trigger. If the relief, the aid, had been distributed properly, the subsequent suffering, the high prices, the immediate threat of starvation would, by definition, have been mitigated. The flood was the injury, the theft was the refusal of treatment. Therefore, the failure of specific human agency, the diversion by those private hands, is the immediate trigger that converts a systemic crisis into absolute collapse. The tragedy isn't just that the water rose, but that the only available lifeline was intentionally severed.
But I'm sorry, I just don't buy that this one specific aid package was sufficient to overcome the structural challenges. We are making a major assumption that this promised aid was adequate to feed a population already on the edge, facing the loss of their entire yield and grappling with an early winter. The text suggests a catastrophe that's just too large for the aid system. It references the severity of the flooding, the shoots scattering like chaff, the early winter month when they are least prepared. If the structural context is one where farmers are already one bad season away from having to chew tree leaves, then the systemic fragility is the greater narrative. The theft doesn't cause the famine. It merely confirms the inherent unreliability of external relief in a system designed to fail the rural poor year after year. The moral failure is obvious, yes, but the deeper social commentary is on the structural vulnerability that makes relief efforts a cruel joke in the first place.
But if the author wanted to focus on systemic vulnerability, why spend the most pointed, emotionally charged language condemning the rat, rather than detailing the failures of the market or the insufficiency of government reserves? That choice to personalize the critique, to point the finger directly at the thieving official, that's a strategic choice. It implies that while systems may be imperfect, human agency and morality still retain the power to save or to condemn. The author is suggesting that even in the face of environmental disaster, the greatest outrage is the intentional choice to betray the most vulnerable.
Well, the author's choice to use the rat metaphor could also be interpreted as a political necessity, couldn't it? A direct critique of the structural failings of the empire, the lack of reserves, the unfair land tenure system. That might be impossible or even dangerous. Condemning an anonymous greedy rat, however, is much safer. But even then, the metaphor only works because the context, the starving farmer, the failing harvest, is so universally understood as the enduring truth. The image of the rat is effective precisely because we know the foundation is already unstable. The condemnation of the corruption is the sharpest point on the spear, yes, but the spear itself is the immense systemic suffering of the populace. And let's finally consider the function of that moralizing idiom about ill-gotten wealth. While you argue its inclusion proves the moral focus, I think we need to appreciate the context. Idioms like this were conventional cultural beliefs about karma and consequence. It could easily be interpreted as a general, almost consoling moral reflection added on to the end of the text, a way for the author or the audience to process the immense injustice. It's a way of saying, even if justice fails on earth, these thieves will suffer consequences. This general cultural belief feels secondary to the raw, visceral description of the social reality: submerged crops, chronic labor, and chewing tree leaves.
I see why you believe it functions as a general reflection, but I would argue against separating it from the primary message. Its inclusion is so deliberate, and it strongly binds the text's ultimate purpose to a condemnation of this specific, ill-gotten wealth. It serves as a final, definitive judgment on the private hands that diverted the relief. It closes the interpretive circle, affirming that the ultimate focus of the author's message on human vice and the specific failure of morality when confronted with systemic distress. The text is demanding accountability from individuals, not just railing against abstract economic forces. So in conclusion, I maintain that these texts provide a powerful, focused moral indictment. While the flood creates the devastating context, the specific theft of relief elevates the disaster from natural misfortune to human injustice. The emotional and critical energy of the text is purposefully focused on the character of the greedy rat, making intentional human failure the centerpiece of the critique. The message, for me, is clear. The cruelty of nature is tolerable. The cruelty of man is unforgivable.
And I maintain that, while the corruption is a horrifying and important event, the overwhelming weight of imagery, the physical reality of environmental loss, the chronic pain of worn-to-the-bone labor, and the fatalistic inevitability in that proverb, it all demonstrates that the texts are fundamentally rooted in the enduring structural struggle against poverty and nature's persistent cruelty. The corruption is the inevitable punctuation mark on a precarious existence that was doomed by its economic structure, regardless of any temporary relief efforts.
It is clear the material expertly intertwines external shock, the flooding, with internal failure, the greed.
Indeed. And appreciating the full depth of the tragedy requires acknowledging that the ultimate pain arises from the confluence of both factors. We have to consider which force the author ultimately sees as the primary obstacle to survival: the systemic fragility that sets them up for famine every winter, or the moral frailty of those who steal their one chance at rescue. We'll leave the listener to weigh which force ultimately drives the text's central meaning.